Hello and welcome everyone. In this video, we're going to learn about responsive design. Responsive design is designing your web page to look good on a variety of screen sizes, including mobile phones. Responsive design is going to be one of the more advanced topics we cover in this class, and it can be a little bit challenging. So if you're just sort of getting comfortable building basic web pages with your portfolio, you're in good shape. And you can listen to this video, just try to get the concepts down. But if you're looking for more of a challenge, I think this is one area where you can push yourself because it's become very big in web design. Responsive design really exploded with the advent of mobile phones 10, 12 years ago. These days, a large amount of web traffic, vast majority, is done through mobile phones or other small screen size devices. So the old days of, well, you can always sort of assume that someone's looking at your website through a laptop or a desktop computer. Those days are gone. And it's very important that we build websites that can accommodate users regardless of what screen size they are, what device they're using to visit the site. So in this video, you're going to learn a bunch of sort of tricks and tips. The biggest one being media queries for designing your website for a large screen size or a small screen size. Okay, so to get started, let me just show you what I've got. Here's my web page. You can see in my HTML, I've got just some basic stuff. So usual opening, head, body. Then I've got a little header. And then a grid container. So we're using grid in this video. Inside that grid container, I have 3 items in a side on the left with a header and some paragraph text. I have an article, sort of the middle main content, with another header, some paragraph text, and then I have my third grid item is a second to side on the right with just a header and then a list of delicious peppers. And then at the end, I've got just a little footer. So in the CSS, nothing too fancy here. It's just a bunch of basic stuff. So I've just added a border, changed the font to Arial, added some color, added a little padding here and there to make it look decent. The big thing to note here is that I have grabbed my grid container and I'm set to display grid, so we're using grid. And then I've just created very simply 3 columns where the middle column is 3 times as big as the other 2 side columns. Okay, so that's the code. The first thing I want to talk about is designing for large screen sizes. This one is pretty easy. Basically, we're looking to avoid this situation. You can see I've got a large monitor that I'm using right now, and when I set my screen width to maximum or close to maximum, it looks ridiculous. So I'm turning my head left and right to look at this thing. So the way to avoid this is very simple. You just go to your CSS, and in the body, just give it a max width. Between 1,000 to 1,400 pixels is good. I think the more content you have on your website, the bigger you want, maybe 1,200, 1,300 pixels. But if it's a simple website, you can go as low as 1,000. Let's just go ahead and do 1,000 pixels. And then to center it, we're just going to do margin 0 auto. And so now when I grab my web page and I expand it, as soon as it passes the threshold of 1,000 pixels, it sort of, you just get a little white space in the sides, and that's good. I don't have to turn my head left and right. All the content is center. So designing for large screen sizes is pretty easy. You just sort of add a max width. Designing for small screen sizes is a little more complicated. So the first thing I want to do is show you the developer tools in in Google Chrome. So go ahead and open Chrome on your live preview, and there's these 3 dots here. Click that, and then go to More Tools, and then Developer Tools. Chrome Developer Tools is a very powerful set of tools that you can do all kinds of things with. The only thing we're going to use here is this little phone button. So click the little phone icon. It says Toggle Device Toolbar, and you get something that looks like this. So this is really cool. You can simulate what your website will look like on smaller and larger screen sizes. So right now, this little down arrow, we're looking at a screen size, we're looking at how the web page looks on an iPhone X. We could do a Galaxy S5. We could do an iPad. Or if we're not really sure, but we want to get like a range, we can click responsive. And then you can grab this little arrow here and slide left and right. And then at the top, there's this width value. So right now, this is how it looks when the width is 988 pixels, and it gets smaller and smaller. So let's start with iPhone X. The first thing I'm going to show you is a little funky. We're going to add a meta tag. So by default, mobile phones have this weird setting where even though a phone may be quite small in terms of width, it might be just 400 pixels wide, it will pretend that it is 900 pixels wide or 800 pixels wide. So it'll pretend to be larger than it is. And when it does that, it sort of distorts a lot of the items in the page. It basically takes everything on the page and squishes it down, smushes it, zooms out to make it all fit. But usually it looks kind of ugly and messy, and there's weird things that happen. So you'll note that like here I've got a header 1s, which should be very big and should be much bigger than my other headers, which are header 4s, but they look the same size or roughly the same size because of the default setting where mobile phones pretend that they're bigger than they are. So most developers will get rid of that with a meta tag. So just go ahead and type in your head meta name equals viewport, content equals width equals device width. And you can see a change on the screen. So what this does is we're going to grab the viewport. I'll zoom out of this. So the viewport is the part of the screen that shows the web page. So you follow my mouse cursor. This is the viewport all along the edge of this browser screen here. And so what we're doing is we're grabbing the viewport and we're saying, I want the width of the viewport to always be equal to the width of whatever device you're using. So if you're using a 400 pixel width phone, then the viewport will be 400 pixels wide. And phones won't try to pretend like they're 800 pixels wide anymore. And so when we go to developer tools, click the little phone icon. Now we're looking at an iPhone X, and you can see that it's still bad. There's things we need to fix, but at least the weird things with sizing are fixed. Like our header 1 looks like a header 1, right? So now we can sort of address the problem of how it looks. So when you're using developer tools to sort of look at how something shrinks or grows, really what you're trying to do is diagnose the problem. It might be that, a web page can break for a number of reasons, and it's all sort of peculiar to that particular web page. In this case, it looks like I have this 3-column format, but the width of my screen is not going to be wide enough to accommodate 3 columns, right? So that's what's going on this page, but it depends on your page. It may be that you have a nav bar and it has too many buttons when you shrink, and so they start to stack weirdly. It may be that your background image, when you shrink to a smaller screen size, it starts to distort in strange ways. Or it may be that you're using position absolute, and so elements kind of start to overlap onto each other, right? There's all kinds of things that can go wrong as the screen size shrinks. So you have to sort of diagnose the problem and try to figure out what properties are giving you trouble. In this case, it's the column property. So we need to find a way to change how many columns there are. We have to get rid of these 3 columns. They just don't work for a small screen size. But we want to keep the columns when we have a larger screen size. So the way to do that is with media queries. Go to our CSS. Media queries are very cool. They're very powerful. They're ways in which they're sort of instructions that we give the browser to ask the user's device, what is your device? Can you tell me about it? And then based on what the device says, we can add styles or take away styles or overwrite styles. So let's just show you in practice. So in your CSS at the very bottom, after all your styling, just go ahead and type @media. And then in parentheses, do max width, say 600 pixels. And then we'll add some brackets. And then, so what we're going to do here is we're adding a media query. And the parentheses are what you are checking for. So if you want to check for, if you want to, in this case, we're checking for the width of device, and we're asking if the maximum width of your device is 600 pixels or less, then any styles that I type here in these brackets, I want to apply. So a common thing will be, let's say, I'll grab my grid container. And I'll say color blue. Actually, let's make it a little more distinct. We'll make it a background color. Okay, so let's test this, right? You can see it's turned blue, but let's go ahead and click responsive design. So zoom out. We're at 1024 pixels right now. If we zoom in, as soon as we hit 600, it should turn blue. Boom, there it is. So that's really cool. So here's this notation. You have this little @ sign, and then media, and then a space, and then in parentheses, you have what you're checking. In this case, we're checking the width of the device, and so max width. If it's 600 pixels or less, then we have brackets. And then indented, you have the usual CSS. So here's our selector, and then the property and the value of the property that we want to change. And we could add more. You know, we could do, we can make the footer become red, right? The text of the footer become red. You can add as much as you want. In practice, what you will change is not so much the colors, but something about the layout. You'll overwrite something. So what I would do here, I'll just show you. Instead of colors, I'm going to take my grid container and I'm going to set it to display block. So what I'm saying effectively is, you know, I have this div. It's a grid container, and by default it's set to display block. When I apply this value to display grid, then it becomes a grid, and it has 3 columns. Well, what I'm saying here is when you get below 600 pixels wide, turn off the grid. I'm turning you back to display block. Let's see if that works. It does. And you can see the columns are gone. It's now a single column format, and it doesn't look distorted anymore. And you can see it on an iPhone X. Looks good. Now, there are some problems that have occurred. So once I'm below 600 pixels, suddenly you can see my aside information comes first, and the main content of my web page, the text is chili, it comes second. And that might not be ideal. So this is kind of the sort of thing you have to kind of play around with as you add media queries. You go back and you may have to change your HTML a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my aside. Keep it nice and neat. I'm going to put my first aside after my article. Like that. So it looks good when it's on a small screen size, but now when we're over 600 pixels, since we're still doing the 3-column format, when at a larger screen size, it now thinks that my aside is my main content because it comes second. You know, it's the second grid item, so it's going to be 3 times as big as the other. So that's not good. So this is an easy fix, though. We just sort of assign a grid area to everything. Like so. And then we'll give a grid template area prop. We'll use the grid template area property. Article aside to. There. And now we have a 3-column format with everything in the right spot. When we're above 600 pixels and we shrink down to 600 pixels, again, our media query kicks in and we turn off the grid and it's sort of back to regular document flow. So it's sort of going back and forth between your design, your HTML, and your CSS the way it was before you added media queries and the way it was after. It's pretty common. You might have to play around. So, and we can do even more. So let's say I wanted to add another media query. And I want this one to kick in at 800 pixels. So, and now instead of just turning off my grid, I want to change how the grid looks. So I'll just grab my grid container, and I'll say, well, instead of 3 columns, I just want 2 columns. 1FR, 2FR. And I want the columns to look something like this. I want grid template areas. Aside to article. Okay. So I'll give you, just go ahead and think for a moment. What do you think will happen when it's below 800 pixels? Okay. So let's look. So right now it looks normal. We have our 3 columns, right? 1FR, 3FR, 1FR. When we start to go below 800 pixels, let's see. Changes. This media query kicks in, and it switches to a 2-column format. And we have the 2 columns are, well, the second column is twice as big as the first one in terms of width, and then we have sort of aside 1 first, and then the article on the right, and then the second side here, and the article on the right. And then now let's look and see what happens if it goes below 600 pixels. Aha, this one kicks in, and the entire grid container turns off. So this is kind of how you sort of stack media queries, and the reason that we have them at the bottom of our web page is because we want to make sure that if you recall the sort of specificity rules of CSS, the stuff that comes later, all else being equal, will override the things that come earlier. So our grid container display block will override this display grid. But this is kind of how you do web design for a small screen size. You just sort of start where, big as it is, and then you use the dev tools to shrink the screen size. You sort of check what is breaking and where. And then you grab those properties and you change the things that you think are breaking as the screen size gets smaller with media queries. Very cool, very powerful tool. Let's see, I think that's about it. Just sort of talk about this is the approach we've taken here before I end. What we're doing right now is called desktop first web design, where, in fact, we've been doing this probably the whole class, where you start with your design on how it looks on your laptop or your desktop computer, and then you switch to looking at how the website, as you shrink it and you sort of adjust things as you get smaller to make sure it still looks good on a smaller screen size. That's the desktop first. There's a popular movement in web design called mobile first, where web developers will actually start with their dev tools up when they're just starting to code the website before they add anything else. They'll go dev tools and they'll say, okay, I want to design this entire page first for an iPhone X, and they'll design it for that very small screen size. And then they'll sort of say, okay, now that I've got that and looking good, I want to make sure it looks good on a larger screen size, and then they'll use media queries to add things or change things as it gets bigger instead of as it gets smaller. So what you'd be doing is you'd probably be setting minimum width properties. Like min width 600 pixels, min width 800 pixels, and you'd be adding columns rather than taking them away. That's called mobile first design. And it's something that I think is worth looking into, because when you design for a phone first, it really changes how you see the web page. You rethink completely what a nav bar should look like. And you use more drop downs, you're more efficient with your space. And so I think if you really want your pages to look good on a web page, many people will say you should do mobile first web design. So start with how it looks on a phone and then go to a larger desktop computer, as opposed to vice versa. Okay, so that's it. That's media queries and responsive design. So just to recap, we talked about adding a maximum width to your web page so that it looks good on larger screen sizes and using Margin Auto to center it. We talked about using Chrome DevTools to sort of get a preview of how things look on small screen sizes. We added the meta tag, the viewport meta tag, to get rid of that funky behavior that phones have where they pretend to have a bigger screen size than they actually do. And then we learned about media queries to add or overwrite properties, styles on our web page, and to sort of adjust how the web page looks as it gets smaller. So if you have questions about this, go ahead and email me or email your instructor. And that's it.